In the medieval world, belief was not something people merely held casually or questioned with skepticism. It was the very framework through which reality itself was understood, interpreted, and survived. Medieval people lived in a universe where the physical and the supernatural were inseparable, where unseen forces constantly influenced health, weather, fortune, and morality. Illness was rarely a biological event, and almost always a spiritual message. A sudden fever might mean divine punishment, a demonic presence, or an imbalance of the body's invisible humours. Physicians believed that the human body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that personality, intelligence, and even morality were determined by which humour dominated. If someone was depressed, it was not emotional distress, but an excess of black bile. If someone was aggressive, too much bloodletting, leeches, and purging were therefore seen as rational medical treatments, and people submitted to them unquestioningly, even when they worsened the condition or caused death. Disease itself was surrounded by myth. During outbreaks of plague, people believed poisonous vapours called miasma rose from the ground, corrupting the air. Others believed the plague was caused by planetary alignments, divine wrath, or the sins of entire communities. Many sincerely believed that Jews, foreigners, or witches had poisoned wells, leading to violent persecutions justified by fear rather than evidence. The idea that microscopic organisms caused disease was unthinkable. Instead, invisible moral or cosmic forces were blamed. Even animals were believed to participate in this moral universe. Cats, especially black ones, were widely thought to be agents of the devil. Owning a cat could make a person suspect, and killing cats during plague outbreaks ironically worsened conditions by allowing rat populations to explode. Medieval people also believed that the natural world was filled with signs deliberately placed by God for humans to interpret. Comets were not astronomical objects, but warnings of war, famine, or the death of kings. An eclipse was a divine message of impending catastrophe. Unusual births, such as a child born with deformities, were interpreted as omens or punishments rather than medical conditions. A 2-headed calf could cause panic in an entire village, with priests called to explain what sin had angered God enough to produce such a sign. Dreams were believed to be messages from God, angels, or demons, and people took them seriously when making decisions about marriage, travel, or war. The medieval understanding of geography was equally myth-filled. Many believed the earth contained monstrous races living at the edges of the known world, people with dog heads, giant ears they used as blankets, or faces on their chests. These beings were not considered fictional, but real, existing somewhere beyond familiar lands. Maps often included these creatures alongside real cities, reinforcing the idea that the unknown was inherently dangerous and strange. The ocean itself was believed to be inhabited by sea monsters, capable of dragging ships to their doom, and sailors genuinely feared falling off the edge of the world. Even centuries after scholars had mathematically proven the earth was round. Religion dominated every aspect of medieval life, but it was not always gentle or comforting. Hell was believed to be a literal place of physical torment, vividly described in sermons and artwork. People believed demons actively walked the earth, whispering temptations into human ears. Mental illness, epilepsy, or unusual behavior were often seen as signs of demonic possession. Exorcisms were common, and many people died during violent attempts to drive demons out of their bodies. Children were taught from a young age that invisible demons watched their actions constantly, waiting for moments of weakness. Women were particularly affected by medieval myths. It was widely believed that women were naturally weaker, more sinful, and more susceptible to demonic influence than men. Menstruation was thought to be dangerous, capable of spoiling food, rusting metal, or causing crops to fail. Pregnant women were blamed if their children were born with disabilities, accused of sinful thoughts or improper gazes during pregnancy. Midwives who possessed practical medical knowledge were often feared and later accused of witchcraft, simply for understanding the female body better than men did. Witchcraft beliefs were among the most destructive myths. People genuinely believed witches could fly, shapeshift, curse crops, cause storms, and kill infants using supernatural means. Misfortune needed a cause, and witches provided a convenient explanation. A failed harvest, a sudden illness, or an unexplained death could all be blamed on a neighbor practicing dark magic. Confessions extracted under torture were accepted as proof, reinforcing the belief system and justifying further executions. The idea that innocent people could be accused falsely was rarely considered, because the worldview itself assumed hidden evil was everywhere. Even animals were judged through a moral lens. Medieval courts sometimes put animals on trial for crimes, such as pigs executed for killing children. This was not symbolic. People believed animals could possess moral responsibility and could be influenced by demonic forces. Executing an animal was thought to restore moral order. Similarly, plants and stones were believed to possess healing or magical properties. Certain gems were thought to protect against poison, ensure fidelity, or cure madness. Unicorn horns, actually narwhal tusks, were sold for enormous sums as antidotes to poison, and wealthy nobles genuinely trusted them with their lives. Time itself was misunderstood. People believed the end of the world was near, especially during times of war, famine, or plague. Apocalyptic predictions were common, and many sincerely believed they were living in the final generation before divine judgment. Astrology played a major role in decision. Making the positions of planets were believed to influence human fate directly. Kings delayed battles, doctors postponed treatments, and marriages were arranged based on astrological charts rather than personal choice. Perhaps the most powerful medieval myth was the belief that suffering was meaningful and necessary. Pain was seen as a test, a punishment, or a path to spiritual purity. Seeking relief from suffering was sometimes viewed as sinful. This belief kept people from questioning authority, medical practices, or religious doctrines that caused harm. Doubt itself was dangerous. Questioning established belief could lead to accusations of heresy, punishment, or death. These myths were not believed because medieval people were unintelligent, but because they lived in a world without scientific tools, widespread literacy, or reliable information. Knowledge was controlled by institutions, and survival depended on conformity. To question a belief was not merely intellectual rebellion, it was social, moral, and spiritual risk. In a world filled with uncertainty, myth provided order, explanation, and comfort, even when it caused fear and suffering. Medieval people did not believe these ideas blindly because they were foolish. They believed them because, to them, these myths were the most reasonable explanations available for a dangerous and unpredictable world, beyond the beliefs already woven into everyday medieval life. Countless other myths filled the gaps where knowledge ended and fear began, shaping how people understood themselves and the universe. One deeply rooted belief was that the human body could be permanently altered by moral behavior. People believed that sinful thoughts could physically deform the body, that greed could twist the face, and that excessive lust could weaken the bones. Physical beauty was often interpreted as a sign of divine favor, while ugliness was assumed to reflect inner corruption. This belief made compassion rare for those born with disabilities or deformities, who were often shunned, hidden away, or treated as living warnings sent by God. Food and diet were also governed by superstition rather than nutrition. Medieval people believed certain foods could dangerously heat or cool the body, disturbing the humoral balance. Eating fruit was considered risky, especially raw fruit, which was believed to rot inside the stomach and cause illness. Drinking cold water after physical labor was thought to be fatal, as it could shock the body. Spices were believed to ward off disease and evil spirits, which is why the wealthy consumed them obsessively, while the poor were assumed to be more vulnerable to sickness due to their bland diets. Fasting was believed to purify both body and soul, even when it weakened people to the point of collapse. Sleep itself was surrounded by fear. Nighttime was believed to be when demons were strongest. People feared that evil spirits could enter the body during sleep through the mouth, which is why some slept with objects placed nearby for protection, or prayers spoken before bed with extreme seriousness. Nightmares were believed to be physical attacks by supernatural beings rather than psychological experiences. The idea of a night hag, a demon that sat on the chest of sleepers, was widely believed and used to explain sleep paralysis centuries before science could. People genuinely believed they could be killed in their sleep by supernatural forces if they were spiritually unprotected. The medieval understanding of death was equally myth, filled and terrifying. It was believed that the dead could return if burial rituals were not performed correctly. Ghosts were thought to roam not because of unfinished business, but because prayers had not been said properly or sins had not been confessed. At the furthest reach of this mental landscape, medieval belief became inseparable from Fey-normality Fey. What modern observers might label myth was simply the background hum of existence. It was present in how people greeted one another, how they measured time, how they interpreted silence, and how they prepared for sleep. A person did not believe in these ideas any more than they believed in gravity. They moved within them unconsciously. Belief was not asserted, it was assumed. This assumption removed friction from daily life. Questioning would have introduced instability into a world already overflowing with danger. Even the idea of error was constrained. Being wrong about a belief was less frightening than being wrong fail. Solitary insight was a liability. Collective belief offered protection because it distributed responsibility. If everyone was wrong together, no one was individually exposed. Shared certainty created safety, even if that certainty was false. Isolation, not inaccuracy, was the real threat. Medieval people also lived with a constant awareness of fragility, not only of life, but of order itself. The world felt as though it could unravel at any moment. Famine, plague, invasion, or divine displeasure could arrive without warning. Belief acted as stitching, holding reality together. Rituals did not merely symbolize stability, they were believed to fate-produce fate. If rituals stopped, order might collapse. Participation was therefore not optional, it was maintenance. The boundary between fear and reverence was thin. What was feared was often what was worshipped, and what was worshipped was often what was feared. This emotional overlap made belief powerful. Fear kept attention focused. Reverence gave fear dignity. Together, they formed a loop that reinforced obedience without the need for constant coercion. People learned early that survival depended on predictability. Predictable suffering was manageable. Unpredictable freedom was not. Belief reduced unpredictability by offering explanations in advance. Whatever happened, belief had already prepared a meaning for it. There was no shock of randomness, only recognition of a lesson, a test, or a warning. Even disaster felt familiar. The medieval imagination was therefore conservative not out of dullness, but out of caution. Imagining too much invited disappointment, danger, or heresy. Imagination was safest when directed upward, toward heaven, angels, and eternal reward, not outward toward social change, or inward toward personal reinvention. Dreams were allowed, but only dreams that did not disturb the existing structure. Over time, this produced a culture where endurance was the highest form of intelligence. To survive mentally and emotionally, one had to accept. Acceptance was not resignation, it was wisdom. The person who adapted to suffering without protest was praised, while the person who resisted was seen as reckless or spiritually immature. Strength was quiet. Compliance was competence. Even joy was carefully contained. Moments of happiness were welcomed, but they were treated as brief and conditional. Lasting joy belonged elsewhere after death. Expecting too much joy in life was dangerous because it made loss sharper and obedience harder. By keeping expectations low, belief protected people from despair. Hope was deferred by design. In this way, medieval myths functioned less like stories and more like infrastructure. They supported emotional survival, social cohesion, and psychological endurance. They were not clung to blindly, they were relied upon. They were tools, not toys. To discard them without replacement would have meant emotional and social collapse. This is why medieval people believed without question, not because they were incapable of thought, but because belief was the framework that allowed thought to exist without destroying the thinker. In a world where the margin for error was razor thin, certainty, any certainty, was safer than openness. Belief was not the opposite of intelligence in the medieval world. It was the shape intelligence took when knowledge was scarce, danger was constant, and survival depended not on changing the world, but on enduring it. At this final depth, belief no longer felt like something inherited or taught. It felt inevitable. For medieval people did not experience belief as pressure from above. They experienced it as gravity. You did not argue with gravity. You learned how to live under it. To imagine a life without belief would have felt as impossible as imagining a body without weight. Belief did not constrain reality. It defined its limits. What modern minds often overlook is that medieval belief reduced cognitive overload. In a world with relentless uncertainty, belief simplified decision, making when every choice carried potential danger. Rules were relief. Clear prohibitions, prescribed rituals, and inherited explanations spared people from constant evaluation. One did not need to calculate outcomes. One needed only to comply. This reduced anxiety in a world already saturated with fear. The medieval person also lived with an acute awareness that survival was communal, not individual. Belief synchronized behavior, shared rituals, aligned emotions, responses, and expectations. When everyone believed the same thing, reactions became predictable. Predictability was safety. A person who believed differently disrupted coordination and therefore threatened survival, even unintentionally. This made conformity feel not only moral, but practical. Over generations, belief trained people to reinterpret loss before grief could destabilize them. Children were lost so frequently that grief, if untreated, could destroy a community's emotional capacity. Myth reframed loss as divine necessity, mercy, or testing. This did not erase pain, but it contained it. Belief acted as a psychological dam, preventing sorrow from flooding everything else. Even curiosity was filtered through belief. Curiosity that reinforced doctrine was encouraged. Curiosity that threatened it was dangerous. This created the illusion of intellectual life without real freedom of inquiry. Questions were allowed, but only those whose answers were already known. Exploration existed, but within a fenced field. Outside the fence lay danger, not discovery. The medieval sense of self was therefore not exploratory, but preservative. The goal was not to find oneself, but to hold oneself together. Stability mattered more than authenticity. Consistency mattered more than expression. Identity was something to protect, not reinvent. Change risked rupture, and rupture risked annihilation. Belief also transformed fear into familiarity. Hell, demons, judgment, and punishment were terrifying, but they were known terrors. Known fear is easier to manage than unknown possibility. People could prepare for known fear with ritual, prayer, and obedience. Unknown fear offered no defense. Myth domesticated terror by naming it, mapping it, and assigning rules to it. Over time, belief shaped emotional expectations so thoroughly that people rarely experienced disillusionment. When life was hard, belief had already warned them. When tragedy struck, belief had already explained it. The world behaved as expected, not kindly, but consistently. Consistency itself became comfort. This is why medieval belief systems endured even when they caused harm. Harm within a meaningful structure felt survivable. Harm without meaning felt unbearable. Myth converted suffering into narrative, and narrative into endurance. Without that conversion, despair would have been overwhelming. Ultimately, medieval people believed without question, because belief allowed them to live without collapsing faith. It preserved coherence in the face of chaos, identity in the face of loss, and community in the face of fear. Belief was not ignorance, it was insulation. From the outside, it looks like submission. From the inside, it felt like balance. The medieval world did not lack intelligence, it lacked safety. And when safety is scarce, the human mind does not prioritize truth. It prioritizes survival. Myth was survival. At this farthest edge, medieval belief functioned like an invisible horizon, always present, never questioned, shaping how far the mind could travel before turning back. People did not feel constrained by it because they had never known a world without it. Just as fish do not perceive water, medieval people did not perceive belief as a system. It was the medium of existence. Life happened inside belief, not alongside it. One of the quietest, but most powerful myths was that endurance itself was proof of worth. To keep going without breaking was seen as success. There was no expectation that life should be kind, only that it should be borne correctly. This belief allowed people to survive unimaginable hardship without seeing themselves as failures. Misery was not evidence that something was wrong with the world. It was evidence that the world was functioning as intended. Belief also shaped how people understood limits. Limits were not obstacles to overcome, but boundaries to respect. Hunger, illness, poverty, and loss were not challenges calling for solutions. They were conditions calling for humility. Trying too hard to escape one's limits risked pride, and pride was believed to invite destruction. Acceptance was safer than struggle. Even courage was redefined. Courage did not mean challenging injustice or confronting power. It meant enduring suffering without complaint. A brave person was one who submitted fully, trusted completely, and doubted least. This inversion made obedience heroic and resistance reckless. Stories celebrated martyrs far more than reformers. Sacrifice mattered more than change. The medieval person also lived with a profound fear of standing out. Visibility attracted attention, and attention attracted judgment. To be noticed was to be evaluated. At the absolute edge of medieval consciousness, belief ceased to be something held and became something fey-lived fey. It shaped posture, breath, reaction, and silence. A person did not need to be reminded what to fear or obey. The world itself reminded them constantly. Church bells structured time, rituals structured days, seasons structured labor, and doctrine structured thought. There was no empty space where an untrained idea could settle. Life itself was a continuous reinforcement loop. Even resilience was myth-shaped. Endurance was not admired because it improved outcomes, but because it proved alignment with divine expectation. A person who survived misery without protest was considered spiritually advanced. Complaining was dangerous, not because it offended others, but because it suggested resistance to divine will. Pain spoken aloud risked being interpreted as rebellion. Silence became a virtue not of strength, but of safety. The medieval understanding of choice was narrow. People made decisions, but only within invisible boundaries. Choices existed inside permission. One could choose how to obey, not whether to obey. Freedom was expressed through devotion, not autonomy. This made obedience feel voluntary, even when it was compulsory. A person believed they were choosing submission, and that belief made submission easier to bear. The idea of identity itself was externally defined. One was not primarily a person, but a role: son, daughter, peasant, priest, wife, subject. To step outside a role was not self-discovery, it was danger. Roles carried protection. Outside them, one was exposed to judgment, suspicion, and punishment. Belief locked identity into place and called it stability. Even error had meaning. When things went wrong, it was rarely attributed to ignorance. Ignorance was not yet a category of explanation. Instead, failure implied imbalance, impurity, or neglect of ritual. This belief made learning difficult, because mistakes were moralized rather than analyzed. Correction came through repentance, not experimentation. The medieval relationship with nature was deeply submissive. Nature was not something to understand and manage, but something to appease. Storms were not challenges to engineer around, they were forces to placate. The earth was alive with intention, responsive to human behavior. Farming was as much spiritual negotiation as physical labor. When crops failed, people searched their consciences before they searched the soil. Belief also shaped how people understood strength. Strength was not power to change circumstances, but ability to endure them. Physical toughness, emotional restraint, and spiritual obedience were the highest virtues. Vulnerability was dangerous unless ritualized. Tears were permitted in prayer, not protest. Anger was acceptable only when sanctioned by authority. One of the most binding myths was that disorder was worse than injustice. Chaos was the ultimate enemy. A flawed order was preferable to no order at all. This belief allowed cruelty to persist under the banner of stability. People feared collapse more than suffering, because collapse meant exposure to the unknown, and the unknown was always imagined as hostile. Memory itself was shaped by belief. People remembered events in moral terms, not factual ones. A flood was remembered as punishment, not weather. A war was remembered as divine judgment, not politics. Over time, cause and effect dissolved into lesson and warning. History became theology told through time. Even silence from authority was interpreted as meaning. If leaders did not intervene, it was assumed intervention was not permitted. Absence of correction meant approval. This belief made power self-sustaining. Authority did not need to justify itself constantly. Tradition justified it automatically. At this depth, belief no longer required explanation. It justified itself simply by existing. To ask why was to misunderstand how the world worked. The world did not owe explanation. It demanded submission. Understanding was not the goal. Alignment was, and so medieval people believed without question, because belief was the only framework that made endurance possible. It transformed fear into structure, pain into purpose, and chaos into order. It told people not how to escape suffering, but how to survive it with meaning intact. From the outside, this looks like blindness. From the inside, it was clarity. In a world where death was close, knowledge was scarce, and power was absolute, belief was not an error. It was the strongest shelter the human mind could build. At the furthest limit of this mindset, belief became so automatic that it shaped even what felt faith thinkable. Medieval people did not suppress ideas consciously. Many ideas never formed at all. Certain questions simply did not arise, not because they were forbidden, but because the mental pathways to reach them had never been built. Thought itself travelled along grooves worn smooth by repetition, ritual, and fear. What lay outside those grooves felt unreal, unsafe, or meaningless. The medieval sense of responsibility was also myth, shaped. Responsibility was inward, not outward. When harm occurred, the instinct was not to ask who caused it, but who failed to prevent it spiritually. A community blamed itself for disaster, believing collective sin attracted punishment. This belief fostered unity, but also redirected attention away from material causes. Floods were met with prayer before engineering, famine with fasting before reform. Spiritual response replaced practical response, because it felt more urgent and more legitimate. People were taught to fear misalignment far more than suffering. A life lived incorrectly, even if comfortable, was considered more dangerous than a life lived correctly in misery. This inverted modern values. Comfort could be suspicious. Ease could signal spiritual danger. Hardship, by contrast, reassured people they were on the right path. Pain became evidence of correctness. The medieval mind also placed enormous trust in repetition. What had been done many times was believed to accumulate power. A prayer spoken thousands of times was stronger than a new one. A custom repeated for generations carried authority beyond reason. Repetition was safety because it reduced uncertainty. Novelty introduced risk. Even small changes could feel threatening because they disrupted the rhythm that belief relied on to feel real. Belief also shaped how people understood failure to receive help. When prayers were unanswered, it did not weaken belief, it strengthened it. The failure was attributed to unworthiness, insufficient faith, or mysterious divine timing. This interpretation preserved the system by absorbing disappointment rather than challenging expectation. Hope was adjusted downward, not questioned. The medieval fear of being foreseen, wrongly seen, was relentless, not just seen by others, but by unseen forces. People worried not only about what they did, but how it appeared spiritually. Intent mattered, but appearance mattered more. Performing righteousness was protection. Inner doubt could be tolerated if outward conformity was maintained. This created a culture where sincerity was secondary to correctness. The imagination of evil was also deeply hierarchical. Evil was believed to operate through structure, ranks, and obedience, mirroring the social order. This made authority feel necessary, even in opposition. If demons had hierarchy, then hierarchy itself must be natural. Power structures were reflected in cosmology, reinforcing obedience by making it seem universal. Over time, belief trained people to expect disappointment but fear deviation. Life was assumed to be hard. That was not the problem. The problem was doing something wrong and making it harder. Safety lay not in improvement, but in avoidance of error. This made life cautious, restrained, and deeply conservative in the truest sense of the word, concerned above all with preservation. Even personal insight was distrusted. If someone felt internally convinced of something that contradicted tradition, that conviction was feared rather than trusted. Inner certainty could be temptation. The self was not a reliable authority. Truth came from outside, from scripture, elders, ritual, not from personal reflection. This prevented introspection from becoming rebellion. The medieval world also treated endurance as a form of contribution. To suffer quietly was to participate in maintaining order. A person who endured without complaint was seen as supporting the moral structure of the world itself. Resistance threatened that structure. Obedience sustained it. This belief gave meaning to lives that would otherwise have felt powerless. Ultimately, belief replaced agency with acceptance, and acceptance with virtue. People learned not to ask how life could be better, but how they could be better fey within fey life as it was. This shift was not weakness. It was adaptation to conditions where change felt impossible and questioning felt dangerous. And so medieval myths were believed without question, because belief was not a layer added to life. It was fey life. It shaped perception before thought, emotion before reason, instinct before choice. In a world where uncertainty could kill, belief offered coherence. In a world where power was absolute, belief offered safety. In a world where suffering was constant, belief offered meaning. To modern eyes, this looks like blindness. To medieval minds, it was survival. At the furthest extreme, medieval belief reached a point where even the concept of alternatives, fae, felt unreal. People did not weigh belief against other possibilities, because other possibilities were not mentally available. The idea that the world could operate by different rules belonged to dreams, heresy, or madness. Reality felt closed, complete, and final. The universe was already explained. At the deepest point, medieval belief reached a state where even inner resistance dissolved into habit. People did not argue with belief because belief had already shaped what felt reasonable. What modern minds might call oppression was experienced as order. What might seem irrational was felt as common sense. When a belief was shared by everyone around you, reinforced by authority, ritual, fear, and survival, it no longer appeared as belief at all. It appeared as reality itself. People learnt early that certainty mattered more than comfort. A painful explanation was preferable to an uncertain one. Knowing why something happened, even if the reason was terrifying, was better than not knowing at all. This is why myths flourished. They closed gaps. They sealed cracks in understanding. They transformed chaos into intention. A cruel universe with purpose was easier to endure than a neutral universe without meaning. The medieval person lived in a world where control was minimal and vulnerability constant. Crops failed, children died, disease struck without warning, and violence was always close. Without science, psychology, or reliable medicine, the mind reached for structure wherever it could find it. Myth provided structure. It created rules where nature offered none. It promised that obedience could influence outcomes, that suffering could be negotiated through ritual, prayer, or endurance. Even false control was better than helplessness. Belief also softened loneliness. If angels watched, one was never truly alone. If demons tempted, one's struggles were shared. If saints intervened, help was nearby, even if invisible. Myth populated the silence with presence. It filled empty space with watchers, judges, helpers, and enemies. Emptiness itself was the greatest fear. Over time, belief became intergenerational memory. Children inherited fear as wisdom. Warnings became traditions. Traditions became identity. Identity became destiny. To break belief would have meant breaking continuity with ancestors, community, and self. The cost of doubt was not just punishment. It was alienation from everything familiar. Even moments of doubt, when they arose, were quickly reabsorbed into belief. Doubt was interpreted as temptation, pride, weakness, or attack. The system explained its own cracks. There was no room for doubt to grow, because doubt itself already had a meaning, and that meaning was dangerous. What modern eyes often misunderstand is that medieval belief systems were emotionally efficient. They reduced existential anxiety by offering certainty. They reduced moral complexity by offering clear rules. They reduced responsibility by transferring agency to divine forces. Life was hard, but it was explained, and explanation was comfort. In such a world, believing without question was not laziness or ignorance. It was adaptation. It was how people stayed sane, connected, and alive. To question everything in a time when everything could kill you was not bravery. It was recklessness. And so medieval myths endured, unquestioned. not because people were incapable of seeing beyond them, but because seeing beyond them offered no shelter. Belief was the architecture that held their world together. Remove it, and nothing stood between the individual and chaos. In the end, medieval people did not live in a dark age of thought. They lived in an age where belief carried the full weight of survival. Myth was not the enemy of reason. It was reason's substitute in a world where reason had not yet been given the tools to stand on its own. A final horizon of medieval mentality. Belief no longer required enforcement because it had become instinct. It shaped reflexes before conscious thought had time to intervene. A person flinched at blasphemy the way one flinches from heat. Fear of transgression was physical, not philosophical. The body remembered rules even when the mind was tired. Knees bent automatically. Prayers surfaced without intention. Guilt arrived before analysis. Belief lived in muscle memory. The medieval world taught people that safety came from alignment, not understanding. Understanding was optional. Alignment was essential. One did not need to know why a ritual worked, only that it had always been done. Questioning process felt irrelevant when tradition itself was evidence. If ancestors survived doing something a certain way, then deviation felt reckless. Survival validated belief more convincingly than logic ever could. People also believed that the universe punished imbalance swiftly. Too much pride invited downfall. Too much joy tempted envy or divine correction. Even success was handled cautiously, almost apologetically. Prosperity required visible humility, as if good fortune needed constant justification to remain safe. Celebration was restrained. Gratitude was public. Silence was strategic. The medieval understanding of innocence was fragile. Innocence could be lost not only through action, but through exposure. Hearing the wrong idea, witnessing forbidden behavior, or associating with the wrong person could stain the soul. Moral contamination was believed to spread invisibly like smoke. This belief reinforced isolation, suspicion, and rigid boundaries. Protection meant separation. People did not imagine life as a path towards self-fulfillment, but as a corridor to endure. The goal was not happiness, but correctness. To live correctly was to minimize risk, spiritual, social, and cosmic. Passion was unsafe. Extremes were dangerous. The ideal life was quiet, obedient, and unnoticed. Being overlooked was protection. Even compassion had limits shaped by fear. Mercy was allowed only when it did not challenge order. To forgive was virtuous. To interfere was dangerous. One could feel pity, but not outrage. Outrage implied judgment, and judgment implied equality with divine authority. Accepting suffering was safer than questioning its cause. Over time, belief narrowed the imagination of possibility. People stopped asking what fey could fey be, and focused instead on what fey must fey be endured. Language itself reflected this. Words for patience, duty, submission, and humility were rich and nuanced. Words for protest, reform, or systemic change were scarce or dangerous. The vocabulary of endurance replaced the vocabulary of hope. The medieval mind also feared being wrong more than being harmed. Being wrong meant exposure to punishment that extended beyond life. Harm ended at death, error did not. This imbalance made intellectual risk terrifying. Silence was safer than speculation. Agreement was safer than curiosity. Certainty, even borrowed certainty, was protection. What looks like unquestioning belief from the outside was, from within, a rational response to an unforgiving world. When disease had no cure, explanation mattered more than treatment. When authority controlled survival, obedience mattered more than truth. When death was everywhere, meaning mattered more than accuracy. Belief gave people something solid to hold in a collapsing world. It gave suffering purpose, fear direction, and chaos a face. It allowed people to endure lives that would otherwise have felt unbearable. Myth was not decoration, it was scaffolding. And so medieval people believed without question, not because they were incapable of doubt, but because doubt offered no shelter. Belief was warmth in a cold world, light in an endless night, structure in a universe that otherwise felt indifferent and lethal. To question belief would have meant standing alone, unprotected, and exposed. In the end, medieval myths were not merely stories people told. They were the rules by which reality could be survived. At this ultimate depth, medieval belief became indistinguishable from instinctual survival behavior. People did not weigh belief against evidence, because evidence itself was interpreted through belief. Observation did not correct doctrine. Doctrine corrected observation. If the eyes saw something that belief did not allow, the eyes were assumed to be mistaken, tempted, or deceived. Reality was not what happened, but what should have happened according to inherited meaning. This inversion made belief immune to contradiction and turned experience into a servant of myth rather than its challenger. People learned to live inside permanent uncertainty without ever naming it. They were surrounded by death, violence, hunger, and unpredictability, yet trained never to frame these conditions as problems to solve. Instead, they were conditions to endure correctly. The question was never, how do we change this? But how do we survive this without angering the forces that govern it? This mindset converted passivity into virtue and resignation into strength. The medieval relationship with fear was paradoxical. Fear was constant, yet normalized. Living in fear did not feel abnormal, it felt responsible. To be unafraid was suspicious, even dangerous. Courage was not fearlessness, but obedience under fear. Those who seemed too calm, too confident, or too unaffected by threats were sometimes viewed as spiritually compromised or protected by dark forces. Anxiety was proof of awareness. Belief also shaped how people processed contradiction within themselves. When actions conflicted with belief, belief was not questioned, the self was condemned. Hypocrisy was internalized as guilt, rather than externalized as inconsistency. This allowed belief to remain intact at the cost of personal peace. Inner conflict was resolved through confession, punishment, or denial, not reflection. The medieval sense of morality was intensely binary. Actions were either right or wrong, pure or corrupt, safe or dangerous. Ambiguity was terrifying because it left no clear path to protection. Grey areas exposed the soul to risk. This rigidity simplified life in a dangerous world, but crushed nuance. Mercy was allowed only when rules permitted it. At the outermost boundary of medieval consciousness, belief became so instinctive that it no longer felt like belief at all. It felt like nature. People did not wake up deciding to believe. Belief woke up with them. It was embedded in posture, routine, tone of voice, and instinctive reactions. Fear of unseen judgment shaped how people walked through streets, how they lowered their eyes, how they spoke carefully even among friends. The body itself learned obedience before the mind could question it. The medieval world trained people to accept contradiction without discomfort. A loving God who punished endlessly was not a paradox to resolve, but a mystery to submit to. Mystery was not a problem. It was proof of divine depth. Understanding too much was suspicious. The unknown was safer when wrapped in reverence. This mindset allowed mutually opposing ideas to coexist peacefully, so long as authority endorsed them. Even suffering others caused was easier to accept than suffering without meaning violence. Disease, famine, and injustice all felt survivable if they could be interpreted as purposeful. Randomness was the true terror. A meaningless death was more frightening than a painful one with a spiritual explanation. Myth softened horror by turning it into narrative. People also believed that endurance itself generated value. Simply surviving hardship was seen as productive, even if nothing improved. A life filled with struggle was not a failure. It was evidence of being chosen for testing. This belief reframed stagnation as virtue. Waiting became action. Patience replaced protest. The medieval relationship with authority was not purely forced. It was emotional. Authority offered certainty. Kings, priests, and elders were trusted, not because they were always kind, but because they removed the burden of choice. Obedience relieved anxiety. To be told what to do, what to believe, and how to live was comforting in a world where independent decisions could be fatal. Even when people sensed something was wrong, they often lacked the language to articulate it. Discomfort was internalized as personal sin rather than systemic failure. Pain was private, not political. This prevented collective questioning and kept myth intact. The structure did not need to silence rebellion. It prevented rebellion from forming in the first place. Myth also shaped emotional range. Certain emotions were encouraged: fear, humility, reverence, while others were constrained. Anger was dangerous unless sanctioned. Joy was permitted only in moderation. Love was regulated. Emotional expression was filtered through morality, not authenticity. The inner life became a battlefield rather than a refuge. As death approached, belief tightened its grip. The final moments of life were filled with terror, not of dying, but of dying incorrectly. Words spoken at the wrong time, thoughts left unconfessed, rituals performed imperfectly. These were feared more than pain itself. The end of life was not release, but examination. What modern eyes often miss is that medieval people were not constantly miserable. Belief also brought comfort, belonging, and clarity. It gave suffering dignity, fear direction, and life coherence. Myth made the world intelligible even when it was cruel. It gave people a way to endure what they could not change. And so medieval myths survived, not because people were unable to question, but because questioning offered no safety. To doubt was to risk isolation, punishment, damnation, and psychological collapse. Belief was not simply inherited, it was reinforced daily by survival itself. In the end, medieval people believed without question, because belief was the strongest shelter they had against a world that offered little mercy and no guarantees. Myth did not weaken them, it held them together. At the final stretch of this worldview, belief became so deeply internalized that even resistance felt impossible to imagine. Medieval people did not think of themselves as trapped inside a belief system. They thought they were fae inside reality fae. To step outside belief would have required a concept of outside that simply did not exist. The world was not divided into facts and interpretations. It was a single, unified truth where explanation and existence were the same thing. What fae was fae, and what ferment fae were inseparable. Even suffering that repeated across generations was normalized through myth. If a family remained poor for centuries, it was not seen as injustice, but as inheritance of a spiritual condition. Lineage carried moral weight. Ancestors' sins were believed to echo forward in time, shaping the fate of descendants. This belief bound people to their past inescapably. One did not simply inherit land or name, but guilt, obligation, and destiny. Breaking free from one's station felt not just difficult, but unnatural and dangerous. The medieval mind also feared imbalance more than pain. A harsh life that followed familiar rules felt safer than a comfortable life that violated expectation. Predictable misery was preferable to uncertain change. This is why even oppressive customs were defended fiercely, because they were known. Stability was survival. Disruption, even if promising relief, threatened the coherence of the world. Storytelling continued to reinforce this mental structure. Tales of saints emphasized endurance, obedience, and suffering rewarded only after death. Villains were almost always those who defied authority, questioned rules, or sought power outside their assigned role. Rarely were tyrants framed as villains simply for cruelty. Instead, rebellion itself was portrayed as the true danger. Stories taught not how to improve life, but how to endure it correctly. Fear of being seen incorrectly was constant. Reputation was not just social, it was metaphysical. Being thought sinful could make one sinful. Suspicion alone could draw misfortune. This belief made people careful, restrained, and cautious in every interaction. Authenticity was risky. Safety lay in appearing correct rather than being truthful. The medieval imagination also struggled with the idea of internal contradiction. To feel conflicted was frightening because it suggested moral confusion. People sought certainty, not because it was comforting, but because ambiguity felt like spiritual vulnerability. Doubt weakened defenses. Clarity, even harsh clarity, felt safer. Even love of life was restrained. Loving the world too much was believed to bind the soul to it, making death more frightening and salvation more difficult. Attachment itself was risky. People were encouraged to hold everything lightly. Possessions, relationships, even their own bodies, because everything was temporary and potentially distracting. Grief was controlled not to heal the heart, but to protect the soul from despair. The belief system also shaped how people imagined evil's intelligence. Evil was not chaotic. It was clever, patient, and subtle. It exploited loopholes, moments of pride, lapses in vigilance. This belief made constant alertness necessary. Relaxation was dangerous. Trust was conditional. Vigilance was virtue. Perhaps most importantly, medieval people believed that the universe was fey just fey, even when it appeared cruel. Justice did not need to be visible immediately. It could be delayed, hidden, or eternal. This belief prevented despair, but also numbed outrage. If justice would come eventually, there was no need to demand it now. By the time a person reached adulthood, belief was no longer something taught. It was something felt. Fear, obedience, hope, shame, and meaning were woven together so tightly that pulling on one strand threatened to unravel the whole fabric, and so belief endured, unquestioned, not because medieval people lacked reason, but because reason had been trained to serve belief rather than challenge it. In that world, myth was not illusion. It was structure. It was protection. It was the language through which reality could be endured. To believe without question was not weakness. It was the most rational response available to people, living in a time where certainty, even imagined certainty, was the only refuge against chaos. At this point, belief no longer functioned as a set of ideas, but as an emotional reflex. Medieval people reacted before they reasoned. Fear, reverence, guilt, and submission rose instinctively, like pulling a hand away from fire. The mind did not pause to analyze. It recognized patterns taught since childhood and responded automatically. A strange sound at night was not evaluated. It was known to be dangerous. A sudden illness was not questioned. It meant something. Meaning came faster than thought. And one of the most powerful myths was that safety came from correctness, not truth. Being correct meant following ritual, obeying authority, and aligning with tradition. Whether something actually worked mattered less than whether it was approved. A failed ritual felt safer than an unapproved solution. This belief kept people loyal to systems that harmed them, because harm within the rules felt less dangerous than help outside them. The medieval person also lived with a constant sense of being tested. Life was not neutral terrain. It was examination. Every challenge was a question with a right and wrong answer, and the consequences were eternal. This belief turned ordinary choices into moral gambles. What to eat, where to walk, whom to trust, when to speak. Nothing was trivial. Exhaustion was common, not just from labor, but from vigilance. Even gratitude was shaped by myth. People were taught to be grateful not for comfort, but for survival. Gratitude was directed upward, not outward. Thankfulness replaced expectation. To expect more was to risk disappointment and spiritual danger. This mindset dulled outrage and softened resistance. If survival itself was a gift, then suffering became acceptable. At the furthest reach of medieval belief, myth did not merely explain life, it explained why. One must accept life as it was. Fey people believed that questioning too deeply could fracture the fragile balance holding the world together. Doubt was not curiosity, it was arrogance. To ask why suffering existed was to suggest God had erred. A thought so dangerous it bordered on spiritual suicide. This belief trained people to turn inward when pain came, searching for fault within themselves rather than flaws in the world around them. Even silence between people carried meaning. Awkward pauses were not socially neutral. They were often interpreted as hidden judgment, unspoken sin, or spiritual tension. People feared being alone with their thoughts because the mind, left unguarded, was believed to wander toward temptation. Constant activity, conversation, prayer, or labor functioned as protection. Stillness was unsafe. The medieval sense of justice extended beyond life into eternity. Many believed that earthly punishment could reduce suffering after death. Harsh sentences were sometimes accepted willingly because enduring pain now was thought to shorten torment later. This belief allowed cruelty to disguise itself as mercy. Execution was framed not as loss of life, but as moral correction finalized by God. Shame functioned as a social glue. Public humiliation was not merely corrective, but purifying. Stocks, public confessions, and visible penance were believed to cleanse the soul through exposure. Privacy was suspicious. Secrecy implied guilt. A good person had nothing to hide, not because hiding was immoral, but because the world itself was assumed to be morally transparent. The medieval mind also feared excess in all forms: too much happiness, too much sorrow, too much love, too much curiosity. Balance was spiritual safety. Extremes suggested loss of control, and loss of control invited evil influence. Moderation was not moderation for health, but moderation for survival of the soul. The body's fragility reinforced belief constantly. Injury, infection, and death were ever present. Without medical explanations, people needed meaning more than cures. Myth transformed random tragedy into narrative. A child's death became divine will. A failed harvest became moral instruction. Grief became obedience. People also believed that evil preferred disguise. The most dangerous threats were not obvious monsters, but familiar faces, neighbors, friends, even family. This belief bred vigilance and suspicion. Kindness could be manipulation. Intelligence could be temptation. Difference could be danger. Conformity became safety. Even forgiveness carried fear. Being forgiven by God did not mean freedom from consequence. Divine mercy was believed to coexist with lingering punishment. Suffering after confession was not contradiction, it was refinement. This belief made peace elusive. Salvation was hoped for, but never felt secure. Ultimately, medieval people lived in a world where meaning was compulsory. Nothing could be meaningless, because meaninglessness implied chaos. Myth filled every crack in reality, sealing uncertainty shut. The cost was doubt, curiosity, and freedom of thought. The reward was order in a world that offered little mercy. They believed without question, not because they were blind, but because belief was the only structure strong enough to hold back fear. In a time where the unknown could kill, certainty, however imagined, was survival. At the very end of this chain of belief, medieval myth reshaped how people understood truth itself. Truth was not something to be discovered through testing or comparison. It was something inherited. If parents believed it, if priests repeated it, if ancestors lived by it, then it was true by virtue of survival. Longevity of belief was evidence of correctness. A false idea, people assumed, would have been destroyed by God long ago. This assumption made ancient errors nearly immortal. Language itself reinforced obedience. Words like order, place, and duty were moral absolutes. To step outside one's place was not ambition, but sin. A peasant dreaming of authority, or a woman desiring independence, was not misunderstood. They were spiritually dangerous. Desire itself was treated as rebellion against the cosmic structure. This belief ensured that social mobility felt unnatural and frightening, even to those who suffered most under it. The medieval relationship with fear was intimate and constant. Fear was not an emotion to overcome, but a guide to proper behavior. Fear of God, fear of hell, fear of social exclusion, fear of the unknown. These were considered healthy, even virtuous. Courage was not the absence of fear, but obedience, despite it. Bravery meant enduring what one was told must be endured. Myth also shaped how people imagined evil. Evil was not abstract. It was intentional, personal, and strategic. It sought weaknesses, exploited doubt, and punished pride. Misfortune was rarely random. It was believed to be targeted. This belief made people hyper, aware of their own flaws, constantly scanning themselves for vulnerabilities that evil could exploit. Self-blame was safer than randomness. Even generosity carried calculation. Charity was rarely unconditional. Giving to the poor was believed to earn spiritual credit, a kind of moral currency stored for the afterlife. Good deeds were investments, not expressions of empathy. This did not make kindness insincere, but it made it transactional, shaped by fear of punishment, rather than love of humanity. The medieval sense of freedom was narrow and inward. External freedom, choice, movement, expression, was limited and distrusted. Inner freedom, defined as submission of desire, was praised. A person was considered free when they no longer wanted what they could not have. This redefinition made deprivation appear virtuous and injustice tolerable. As generations passed, these myths hardened into instinct. Children learned fear before reason. By adulthood, belief felt like common sense. The myths no longer felt imposed, they felt obvious. The most powerful beliefs were those never recognized as beliefs at all. And so medieval people believed without question, because belief was not something they chose. It was the water they swam in. To question it would have required imagining a world without it, and that world was more terrifying than any demon, plague, or punishment myth could invent. At the last depth of medieval thinking, belief fused so completely with survival that even imagination itself was regulated. Imagining alternatives to the world as it was could feel sinful, because imagination suggested possibility, and possibility suggested that God's order was not fixed. Fantasy was not a playground of creativity, it was dangerous territory. Stories that strayed too far from accepted moral structures were feared for their power to loosen discipline. The mind was trained not to wander freely, but to walk familiar paths, returning again and again to the same explanations, the same lessons, the same warnings. Hope for justice was postponed endlessly. If injustice went unpunished, people believed it would be corrected in the afterlife. This belief prevented despair, but it also prevented reform. There was no urgency to fix systems that were assumed to be temporary trials. Earthly life was framed as a test, not a home. Suffering was not a failure of the world, but proof that the test was functioning as intended. To demand fairness here and now could be seen as misunderstanding the purpose of existence itself. The medieval fear of isolation was profound. Being cut off from community was more terrifying than physical pain. Excommunication was feared worse than death, because it meant exclusion not only from society but from salvation. This fear ensured conformity more effectively than violence. People obeyed because belonging meant safety, spiritually and materially. Alone, one was exposed to chaos. Even kindness had boundaries. Compassion that challenged authority was suspect. Helping someone who had been judged sinful could feel risky, as if mercy itself might be interpreted as rebellion. Forgiveness was allowed only within approved structures. Independent moral judgment was dangerous, because it suggested humans could evaluate right and wrong without divine mediation. The medieval sense of self-control was relentless. Desires were not neutral impulses, but enemies to be subdued. Hunger, lust, curiosity, anger. Each was viewed as a potential opening through which evil could enter. Discipline was praised not because it improved life, but because it reduced vulnerability. The ideal person was not joyful or fulfilled, but restrained. Even the concept of progress felt alien. Improvement implied that the present was flawed in a way that mattered. Instead, people sought stability. Change was tolerated only when it could be framed as restoration of an older, purer state. Innovation needed justification through tradition, not effectiveness. Myth also shaped how people processed contradictions. When beliefs conflicted with experience, experience was distrusted. A miracle explained failure. A mystery explained inconsistency. Ambiguity was resolved through authority rather than inquiry. This protected belief from erosion, allowing it to survive centuries of contradiction without collapse. What is most striking is not that medieval people believed so many myths, but how complete the system was. Every fear had an answer. Every loss had a meaning. Every question already had a response waiting. There was no intellectual vacuum for doubt to grow in. The system did not need to be true. It needed to be total. And so belief endured, unquestioned, not because medieval people lacked intelligence, but because intelligence had nowhere safe to stand outside belief. Myth was not a weakness of the age, it was its defense mechanism. At the deepest level, medieval myths shaped how people experienced existence moment by moment, often blurring the line between inner thought and external reality. Thoughts themselves were believed to have power. Entertaining a sinful idea was not harmless. It was thought to invite real spiritual consequences. A moment of doubt could attract demons, while excessive pride could summon divine punishment. This belief created intense self-surveillance. People monitored their own thoughts with fear, confessing even imagined sins because the mind was not private. It was exposed to God, angels, and demons alike. Guilt was not emotional but existential, something that could rot the soul and poison the body if left unaddressed. The idea of coincidence barely existed. Nothing happened by chance. If someone tripped, lost an object, or encountered a stranger at the wrong moment, it was believed to carry meaning. Small inconveniences were interpreted as warnings, while unexpected fortune was viewed suspiciously, as blessings could quickly turn into tests or traps. This mindset produced constant anxiety, as every event demanded interpretation. People lived not only their lives, but also the burden of decoding them. Animals were believed to possess hidden wisdom or malicious intent beyond human understanding. Ravens and crows were feared as messengers of death. Wolves were associated with the devil, believed capable of possessing human intelligence and moral awareness. Dogs, on the other hand, were sometimes seen as protectors against evil spirits. Livestock illness was rarely blamed on disease. Instead, it was attributed to curses, envy, or supernatural interference. Farmers performed rituals alongside practical labor, believing spiritual protection was as important as physical effort. Sexuality was one of the most myth-surrounded aspects of life. Desire was treated as dangerous, especially when uncontrolled. Many believed sexual activity weakened the body and shortened life. Celibacy was considered spiritually superior, even for those who married. Nocturnal emissions were feared as signs of moral failure or demonic attack. Women were often blamed for male desire, believed to emit forces that tempted men without intention. This belief justified strict control over women's movement, clothing and speech, reinforcing inequality through myth rather than law alone. Education, where it existed, reinforced belief rather than inquiry. Memorization of sacred texts mattered more than understanding. Logic was taught, but only within boundaries that supported existing doctrine. Questioning foundational assumptions was not intellectual courage. It was rebellion. Knowledge was hierarchical, flowing downward from authority, not upward from observation. This meant errors, once accepted, became permanent truths simply because they were old. Illusions and tricks were often interpreted as supernatural events. Simple optical phenomena, echoes, or reflections could terrify entire communities. Ventriloquism, magnets, or basic mechanical devices were sometimes believed to be magic. Those who understood such things risked suspicion, as unexplained knowledge was dangerous. Innovation was slow, not because people lacked creativity, but because novelty itself was feared. The future was imagined not as progress, but as decline. Many believed the world was decaying, moving further from divine perfection with each generation. Ancient times were considered purer, wiser, and closer to God. This belief discouraged reform and reinforced nostalgia for an idealized past that never truly existed. Hope was directed toward heaven, not improvement on earth. Loneliness was rare physically, but common spiritually. People lived in close quarters, surrounded by others, yet burdened by constant fear of judgment from neighbours, clergy, and unseen forces. Reputation was not just social, it was spiritual armour. To be suspected was dangerous, because suspicion alone could spiral into accusation, punishment, or death. Trust was fragile, and conformity was safety. Perhaps the most tragic myth was that suffering was proof of worth. The more one endured, the more righteous one was believed to be. This idea made cruelty acceptable and compassion conditional. Helping the suffering was virtuous, but questioning why suffering existed was not. Pain was not a problem to solve, but a message to accept. Taken together, medieval myths created a world where belief was not optional. Doubt was dangerous, and imagination filled every gap left by uncertainty. These people did not live in a simpler time. They lived in a heavier one, where every shadow meant something. Every breath carried moral weight, and every moment demanded obedience to invisible laws. They believed without question because questioning would have shattered the fragile order holding their world together. And so myth endured, not as ignorance, but as the lens through which reality itself was survived. As belief continued to dominate medieval consciousness, even the idea of the self was shaped more by myth than by individuality. A person did not primarily see themselves as an independent being with personal goals, but as a soul temporarily inhabiting a body, constantly evaluated by divine forces. Identity was collective and spiritual, rather than personal. One's worth was measured not by happiness or fulfillment, but by obedience, humility, and endurance. To desire too much joy, comfort, or recognition was seen as spiritually dangerous, as if happiness itself could provoke punishment. The concept of memory was also mythologized. People believed memories could be influenced or even implanted by supernatural forces. Sudden intrusive thoughts were often attributed to demons testing faith. Forgetfulness was not a cognitive limitation, but a moral failure or divine rebuke. Remembering sacred texts was seen as evidence of spiritual purity, while forgetting prayers or rituals was feared as a sign of corruption. This belief placed immense pressure on the mind, turning ordinary mental lapses into existential threats. Sound carried mystical significance. Bells were believed to physically repel demons, storms, and illness. Church bells were rung during lightning storms, not symbolically, but because people believed sound waves disrupted evil forces in the air. Whispers were feared at night, as they were thought to be voices of spirits rather than echoes or animals. Silence, especially unnatural silence, was deeply unsettling and often interpreted as the presence of something unseen and hostile. The medieval relationship with pain extended beyond endurance into reverence. Self-inflicted pain through fasting, flagellation, or deprivation was practiced sincerely as a means of spiritual purification. Many believed that denying the body weakened the influence of the devil, who was thought to operate primarily through physical desire. Comfort was not neutral, it was suspicious. Soft beds, rich food, and leisure were believed to soften the soul and invite moral decay. This belief normalized suffering so deeply that kindness toward oneself could feel like sin. Madness, grief, and despair were rarely understood as human experiences. Prolonged sadness was often interpreted as spiritual failure or possession. Grief beyond an accepted period was discouraged, as excessive sorrow suggested lack of faith in divine will. Those who could not recover emotionally were often isolated, prayed over, or punished rather than comforted. Emotional resilience was demanded, not nurtured. Even tools and technology were viewed through myth. New inventions were often feared before they were accepted. Anything that appeared to defy natural order, mechanical clocks, optical lenses, or complex machinery, could provoke suspicion. The fear was not that technology failed, but that it worked too well, suggesting unnatural assistance. Progress was slow because safety lay in the familiar, not the effective. The act of storytelling itself reinforced belief. Stories were not entertainment, but instruction. Legends, saints, lives, and miracle tales were treated as historical truth. Children grew up hearing stories designed not to inspire imagination, but to regulate behavior through fear and reverence. Fiction as a category barely existed. A story was assumed to be true, unless explicitly condemned. Longevity and aging carried their own myths. Living too long could be suspicious, as it suggested unnatural favor or hidden sin. Sudden vitality in old age was sometimes feared rather than celebrated. Conversely, dying young was often framed as divine mercy. These beliefs softened grief, but also erased the tragedy of early death, normalizing loss on a massive scale. The medieval fear of impurity extended to social interaction, touching certain people, criminals, the sick, the poor, was believed to transmit not just disease but moral corruption. Charity was encouraged, but distance was maintained. Compassion was structured and controlled, not spontaneous. Helping others was virtuous, but becoming too close to suffering was feared. Underlying all these beliefs was a deep conviction that the universe was watching. Nothing was private. Every action, thought, and impulse was recorded in an invisible ledger. This constant surveillance created obedience without force, conformity without chains. Fear was internalized, self-enforcing, and passed from parent to child as wisdom. In this world, Myth was not superstition layered on top of reality. It was fey reality. It shaped perception, emotion, morality, and survival itself. Medieval people believed without question because belief was the price of belonging, safety, and meaning. To doubt was not to think freely, but to risk exile from community, from God, and from the fragile certainty that held their terrifying world together. Even deeper layers of medieval belief reveal how myth did not merely explain the world, but actively governed daily behavior, shaping fear into habit and tradition into law. One powerful idea was that the body itself was porous to spiritual forces. People believed evil could enter through the eyes, ears, mouth, or even the skin. This fear led to strict rules about what one could look at, hear, or touch. Certain images were believed to inflame sinful desires instantly, so art and sculpture were heavily controlled. Music was thought to directly affect the soul. Particular melodies were believed to invite melancholy, lust, or even possession. Silence, prayer, and repetition were considered safer than expression or creativity. Travel was viewed as inherently dangerous, not only because of bandits or disease, but because leaving familiar land meant entering spiritually unstable territory. Crossroads were believed to be places where demons gathered, which is why executions and burials of criminals often occurred there. Forests were feared as spaces where divine order weakened and chaos ruled. Many genuinely believed that fairies, spirits, or demons lived in the woods, capable of luring travelers to madness or death. Getting lost was not just a geographical problem. It was often interpreted as a spiritual failure or punishment. Fire held a special place in medieval myth. It was seen as both divine and infernal, capable of cleansing sin or consuming the damned. House fires were believed to reflect moral impurity within the household. Candles blessed by priests were thought to ward off storms, illness, and demons. Even the way a flame flickered was read as a message. Steady flames meant favor. Erratic ones meant danger. People watched fire not just for warmth, but for meaning. Money and wealth were surrounded by contradictory beliefs. While wealth was often seen as a blessing, excessive riches were believed to attract demonic influence. Coins were sometimes suspected of being cursed, especially if acquired suddenly. Merchants were distrusted, not only socially but spiritually, as profit itself was seen as morally dangerous. Charging interest was widely condemned, believed to corrupt the soul and invite eternal punishment. Yet trade was essential, creating a constant moral tension that people navigated through confession rather than reform. Miracles were not rare events, they were expected. People believed saints actively intervened in daily life, curing illness, protecting crops, and punishing disbelief. Relics, bones, clothing, or objects associated with saints were believed to contain literal divine power. Entire towns competed for relics, convinced that possessing one would guarantee protection and prosperity. Fraudulent relics were common, but belief mattered more than authenticity. Faith alone was thought to activate their power. Silence and speech were both feared. Speaking too much was believed to weaken the soul, while silence could protect it. Confession was mandatory because unspoken sins were believed to rot the soul from within, eventually manifesting as physical disease. Shame was considered medicinal. Public humiliation was thought to cleanse moral corruption. This belief justified brutal punishments not as cruelty, but as healing for both the individual and society. The concept of childhood itself was different. Children were not seen as innocent in the modern sense, but as morally incomplete beings needing constant correction. Play was often discouraged, believed to invite laziness and sin. Laughter was sometimes viewed with suspicion, as excessive joy could distract from spiritual duty. Education focused less on curiosity and more on memorization and obedience, reinforcing belief rather than inquiry. Even numbers carried supernatural meaning. Certain numbers were believed to be holy or cursed. The number 3 symbolized divine perfection, while others were associated with evil or chaos. Dates were carefully chosen for weddings, journeys, and surgeries, based on numerical symbolism rather than practical considerations. Calendars were spiritual tools as much as timekeepers. Pain management was almost non-existent because pain itself was considered meaningful. Childbirth was believed to be a punishment placed on women, and attempts to ease it were sometimes condemned as interfering with divine will. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia, not only due to lack of knowledge, but because suffering was thought to purify the soul. Enduring pain without complaint was praised as a sign of virtue. Perhaps the most pervasive myth was that knowledge itself was dangerous when accessible to the wrong people. Curiosity could be sinful. Asking why too often could suggest doubt, and doubt was a gateway to heresy. This belief ensured that myths survived unchallenged for centuries, passed down as unquestioned truth rather than examined ideas. These layers of belief formed a closed system. Every fear reinforced another. Every ritual justified the next. When something went wrong, the explanation always existed within the myth itself, making it self-sustaining. The medieval mind did not lack intelligence. It lacked permission to doubt, and in that absence, myth became reality, not as story or legend, but as lived experience, inescapable, unquestioned, and absolute. As medieval belief sank even further into the rhythms of everyday existence, myth became inseparable from identity itself. People did not simply believe ideas. They believed about themselves, thing through those ideas. A person's fate was thought to be written long before birth, shaped by divine intention, ancestral sin, and cosmic alignment. Free will existed only in theory. Success or failure, health or illness, virtue or vice, were often explained as outcomes predetermined by forces beyond human control. This belief reduced personal agency and made endurance more valued than change. To survive was to submit, and submission was praised as wisdom. Fear of the unknown dominated even the most ordinary actions. Cutting hair or nails at the wrong time was believed to invite illness or bad luck. Mirrors were treated cautiously, as reflections were thought to reveal the soul or attract spirits. Spilling salt was interpreted as a sign of betrayal or impending misfortune, often followed by ritual gestures to ward off evil. Sneezing was feared as a moment when the soul briefly left the body, which is why blessings were spoken immediately, not as politeness, but as protection. The medieval concept of cleanliness was also steeped in myth. Bathing was sometimes avoided because it was believed to open the pores and allow disease or evil spirits to enter the body. Public bathhouses were associated with immorality, not hygiene. Dirt, paradoxically, could be seen as protective, while excessive cleanliness was suspected of vanity or sin. illness caused by poor sanitation was blamed on moral failure rather than environmental conditions, reinforcing cycles of suffering. Silhouettes and shadows carried ominous meaning. A distorted shadow at sunset could be interpreted as a sign of corruption or impending death. People believed that evil beings often appeared without shadows, while saints were sometimes described as glowing or casting divine light. Darkness itself was not merely the absence of light, but a substance associated with danger, deception, and sin. Night travel was avoided whenever possible, not only for safety, but because darkness was believed to belong to forces hostile to humanity. The body after death was a source of profound anxiety. People feared dying suddenly without confession, believing such deaths doomed the soul to eternal torment. This fear led to obsessive rituals around last rites and deathbed prayers. Bells were rung not just to announce death, but to scare away demons hovering nearby, waiting to claim the soul. Cemeteries were considered liminal spaces, where spiritual boundaries blurred, and passing through them required prayer or protective gestures. Social relationships were also governed by myth. Envy was feared as a literal force capable of causing harm through the evil eye. Compliments were avoided or softened to prevent attracting envy. Success was often downplayed publicly to avoid spiritual attack. Misfortune was sometimes blamed on jealousy rather than circumstance, reinforcing distrust within communities. Knowledge of the body was dangerously limited by belief. Internal organs were poorly understood, yet they were thought to house emotions and moral qualities. The heart was not just a pump, but the seat of courage and faith. The liver was associated with passion and desire. Emotional pain was believed to physically damage these organs, making grief not only sad but deadly. Mourning too intensely was discouraged, as it was thought to weaken the body and invite illness. Even colours carried supernatural weight. Certain colours were believed to repel evil, while others attracted it. Red was associated with blood, danger, and protection simultaneously. White symbolized purity, but also death and ghosts. Black was feared not just as a color, but as a presence. Clothing choices were therefore moral decisions, not aesthetic ones. Perhaps most striking was the belief that truth could not evolve. If something had always been believed, it must be correct. The idea that knowledge could improve over time was nearly inconceivable. Ancient authorities were trusted more than living experience. If a respected text contradicted reality, reality was assumed to be deceptive. This belief froze understanding in place, allowing myths to harden into unquestioned doctrine. Yet within this rigid system, medieval people found meaning. Myths gave structure to suffering, explanations for randomness, and comfort in chaos. They transformed an unpredictable world into one that made sense, even when that sense was built on fear.